he has to be very careful in terms of how he communicates what a chair is, right? Because as the slides show you, there's office chairs, magical chairs, wooden chairs, um, porcelain chairs, and then if you're very confused, there's share chair or chair. And so that you'll see here that describing something like chair is not as easy as you would think, so that we have to learn how to harness language. And how do we harness language? Well, it goes back to those four things that we talked about earlier, and then other things like ethos and pathos and logos. Now, even more confusing or hard is when we have something like love. Well, how do you communicate what love is? Because love is so multifaceted. There's sort of romantic love. There's love that you might have for your children, love that you have for cats, and of course, the most important love, the love of food, especially tacos, right? So that this idea, this situation is that as humans, we're always in a situation where someone has an idea and they want to communicate that idea to someone else. That's where you see this next slide where it says a certain situation where you have the intent, which is the idea, and that we put that into what's called a text, or this gets back to the idea of form, because it could be a song, it could be a poem, it could be a painting, it could be a PowerPoint. It's my intent putting it into this form, and then you, the reader, are watching, reading, listening, and gaining significance of it. And so if you notice that there's kind of an invisible barrier there where I can't talk directly to the reader in the sense that I have to put my ideas into something, even if it's just language, like I'm talking to you now. I might have an internal thought, but I have to articulate that internal thought and give it to you through speech, or give it to you through a painting. So there's not a sort of Vulcan mind meld thing where I could just sort of grab onto you and just transfer all my ideas to you. I have to put that into something, okay? Now, the confusion comes where I might have that great intent, but I don't utilize language or whatever mode I'm using to the fullest extent, and that's where there can be disconnection. All right, so the four things we talked about earlier, verbal, discrete, those will help you make sure that you don't sort of screw up that sort of communication. There's other types of rhetorical devices that people use in order to help maintain interest. Those are ethos, pathos, and logos. So let's talk about those now. Ethos, and I decided to put our president there because for better or worse, whatever you feel about him, or any president for that matter, there's this idea that people, there's a credibility about a person, right? And so that if you look at the very early translation of ethos, it actually means dwelling place, not ethics. So why dwelling place? Well, think about this way. All of us dwell in a certain place, right? Or that people view us as living or dwelling in a certain place. So for you, Donald Trump dwells in a certain place or position in society. And obviously that could change depending upon who you are. You might place him really high up here or low, it doesn't matter. How you view him sort of speaks to how you view his character, where you think he lives metaphorically, right? And so I think that's basically what ethos is like, what sort of credibility does this person have? What position do I think that they hold in society? So for instance, you might look at a doctor or a policeman and automatically trust them because they hold a position in society that we value and respect, right? And so that they automatically dwell in this certain area, even though we don't know them. And the same thing too, someone can dwell in a different area. No offense to you lawyers out there, or hopeful lawyers, but society doesn't have the greatest view sometimes of lawyers, right? We think that they dwell in a place of murky sort of intentions and ambiguity, right? So again, these are kind of generalizations. So to go back to the president or any famous person for that matter, The reason why they're able to sell steaks or um, cars or whatever, right, is that we view them dwelling in a certain space, and so that we say, oh, well, they have credibility because they sort of live on that corner, right? So think about every basketball player ever. Why do we buy their shoes? Because we know that they have this credibility and they hold this position in society. This is usually not apparent. Ethos is often implicit. Normally, like if you ever watch an infomercial, um, Donald Trump doesn't have to explain why he's credible to sell those steaks. It's implicit by virtue of him being a celebrity. Same thing with Kim Kardashian, um, or even the doctor that you go to. Like the doctor doesn't have to walk around with the medical diploma on his chest, right? Him or her. That there's this implied credibility, or sometimes lack of credibility, depending upon who this person is. And again, that goes back to how we view where they live. That goes back to dwelling place in our society. By the way, I think that's the hardest one out of it. Next, pathos. Straight to the heart, right? So if you look at this ad, this idea that, it's like Joe Chemo and it's making you feel these emotions, and they're playing on those heartstrings of, like, it's just all emotions. I used to have a link here to that Sarah McLachlan commercial where they play the really sad music and they show the dogs that are in it's just too much for me. But that's all sort of pathos, where it's just trying to get your emotions, right? There are kind of times where people combine these things. So for instance, someone might use pathos to invoke an ethos, like a patriotic duty-bound appeal, like, you're not a true American if you don't do this, right? Or you're not a true Catholic if you don't believe this. So someone might sort of combine these where they're trying to get at this idea of, ethics, but also get at this idea of emotions. Again, I think that one's one of the easiest one. Logos, highly, highly, highly structured. This just goes back to different forms of logic. There's inductive, deductive reasoning. That would take me a whole nother 20 minutes to deal, and I don't want to burden you with that, but it basically just goes about sort of the Sherlock Holmes way of finding out things. In inductive arguments, you're usually using a bunch of different sources to come to a conclusion, and that conclusion is never as solid as a deductive argument, because a deductive argument starts with a known fact and then basically tests things. And so what else we have? There's something called the Tolman method of argumentation, and this is how many research papers are structured. And if you want me to go over that, please let me know, because that could be useful in the research paper that we are doing. But basically the Tolman method is you have an intro that states your thesis, you support that thesis, you have a counterclaim, you have a conclusion. It's pretty, I'm oversimplifying it here, but that's the basic of it. That's what most people, how they write papers to begin with, even if you don't know it has this fancy name or not. There are things called fallacies, and fallacies are sort of flaws in logic. One of my more favorite ones is ergo propter hoc, means this before that, and this fallacy is where you attribute something, cause to something that wasn't really the cause. Like, so for instance, if you said, I found this lucky penny and then I won $1 million. I hate to break it to you, but the lucky penny didn't help you win that $1 million. Okay, well, maybe I'm wrong, but I would consider that an ergo propter hoc fallacy. Fallacies are just these sort of flaws in logic. Okay, now what? So rhetoric is always used. I don't care if you're sort of writing your DB, you're talking about your day, you're making an argument why you should get a raise at work. We're always, always, always using rhetoric, okay? And so that anything added into the original text, like ethos, pathos, logos, which are usually always there, the four things we talked about earlier, like discrete, those things, all of this stuff, okay, this is all part of rhetoric. And so that we could point out any of these things and start talking about rhetoric. this is what you're going to do with the speech this week. Looking at all the different parts of it and trying to break it down using rhetoric to do that. What does this also show us? Well, it shows us the academic papers that you were writing have a sort of roots in history. This is stuff that's been around for ages, so long, and is still being taught today. So there's something that is very beneficial for you to use, because it doesn't matter if you are going to become, the next lawyer, businessman or woman, senator, president, steak enthusiast. You have to use rhetoric in order to get your point across, whatever that point might be, so that if you don't learn this skill, that you're going to be put at a disadvantage. There's a clear situation between reader and writer. We are the reader. You're the reader right now. You're listening to me delivering my message. So I'm the writer or the speaker, and I'm using rhetoric, humor, pathos, and pathos. I'm using logic, hopefully. I'm using, ethos. There's this implied, credibility about my position here. I'm using this to convey a certain message about this topic, so that there's always a situation. You're always going to be in this dynamic of using rhetoric or deciphering rhetoric, right? So even if you're getting coffee, you're in this sort of back and forth situation. Learning how to dissect rhetoric, that's what really makes you able to use it, right? So think of it this way. You want to be a mechanic, you have to know how to take apart that engine and put it back together again. That's what we're doing in the DB this week. We're taking something apart, putting it back together again, examining the pieces so that we can better use rhetoric. And one of the last, second to last slide, any choice that you make as an author or a speaker goes into the design of the text, and that's called rhetoric, right? So if I decide to use humor, then that's a design that I'm putting into the text, and that's a part of rhetoric. Also, just to kind of recap with ethos, pathos, and logos, there's a persuasive set of appeals that runs through all argument of writing, ethos, pathos, logos, namely. And so next week, or this week too, part of the reason why we are doing research is because right now you dwell in a certain space in terms of academia, and you need to back up that sort of space, because you're not credible enough to just sort of talk about these things on your own, nor would you probably want to. So that no matter what situation you're in, we're using these appeals, these different appeals, in order to convey our points, along with those 4 different areas that we talked about earlier. Oh, and that's the last slide. Why did I think there were more? All right, so this was our supersized video. There will not be one ever this long. And to be quite frank, I tried to make this as short as possible. I could have made this double the length, but I didn't want to burden you and everyone else, right? But if you have any questions about rhetoric, I know it's kind of confusing. There's all these different terms being thrown around, so that, if there's any confusion this week, please let me know. This, honestly, though, is one of my favorite weeks and assignments, because I think that this is where the class all comes together. All the things we've been talking about start to merge into one, and hopefully you start to see that this class has real-world applications, that talking about literature is not just fun, like a book club, just sitting around talking about literature. That's not just the point of this class. That the point of this class is to really learn how to be a critical thinker and how to analyze other people's language and how they use it, so that next time when you watch a presidential debate or an office meeting, that you're able to sort of really poke holes and really critically examine what the person's argument it is, because you know what rhetorical devices that they're utilizing, and you can break down those and really see if what they're saying is something you agree with or something that is false. Thank you very much for listening to me today. Again, this is one of my favorite weeks, but I understand that there can be some difficulties, so please don't hesitate when reaching out to me. All right, have a good one. Bye.